I have just found myself a fantastic 4K gaming monitor which I think you're going to absolutely love. It's called the AOC Agon Pro AG326UD, which sports a flat 31.5 inch glossy QD-OLED panel that operates a refresh rate of 165Hz at 4K. Better still, it has got adaptive sync technologies, DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification for that lifelike HDR reproduction, and also has got those fabled HDMI 2.1 ports. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for roughly £650 to £740. Now, in this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. So jumping straight in, let's talk about its input lag, and here subjectively I can say that it does a phenomenal job across the board. Indeed, I had no problems when it came to registering my mouse input while playing a hardcore competitive FPS shooter such as Counter-Strike 2 or Valorant. Indeed, this monitor will be fantastic for all sorts of games, be it RTS, MMORPGs, or indeed for those people who are playing more casual games. And this means that it's going to be fantastic for both PC and also console gamers. Now, better still, its overall response time is fluid. And by fluid, I mean Carlos Sainz levels of smooth operator. Yes, indeed, this monitor has got an OLED panel. And therefore, thanks to the fact that it has also got the 165Hz refresh rate, it means the monitor feels really responsive. Now, to give you some objective numbers, I'm using the OSRTD tool, and here you'll be able to see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen the average initial time, which translates to the average D2G that most manufacturers claim, including AOC. And yes, you can see it clocked in at just 0.92 milliseconds, hitting 100% of the refresh rate window at 165Hz. Now, granted, some people out there will say, why doesn't it have a higher refresh rate? Well, in all honesty, it doesn't really bother me in the slightest, because 165Hz will certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers out there. If you're a hardcore esports gamer, then arguably a 31.5 inch monitor isn't something that you should be looking at in the first place. And in this respect, I do think the manufacturer has really nailed it. Now, as for the overall motion clarity at 165Hz, it's actually pretty good. Although it's worth noting over here that in comparison to higher refresh rate monitors, or indeed those that offer motion blur reduction technologies, it can't quite compete. But yet again over here, given the fact that you do not have to worry about any sort of purple trailing or ghosting like you'd find on an equivalent LCD panel, it means that the overall visual clarity of the monitor is actually very good, and therefore will certainly suffice for the vast majority of gamers out there. Now, this actually perfectly brings me onto adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. Useful, for example, if you want to have that tear-free gaming experience and you're a bit more of a casual gamer. Now, the monitor does not have a native G-Sync module, and therefore has got a VRR range from 48 up to 165Hz. Now, using the NVIDIA Pendulum demo while connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080, I didn't encounter any sort of black screen issues or major flickering problems. However, if you have a keen eye, you might notice that on video there's a little bit of flickering that occurs. And this is a phenomenon that I've noticed on every single OLED that I've tested to date. The VRR flicker is real. However, this doesn't really affect me, at least in person. But it's just something I thought I should point out in case you've got overly sensitive eyes. Now, past this, I should point out that the monitor was able to run at 4K at 165Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled and also HDR. Indeed, all the technologies worked in tandem. And this does actually lead me on to talking about its overall HDR reproduction, which was absolutely phenomenal. The monitor has got the DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification, and for good reason, because if you choose the DisplayHDR mode via the monitor's OSD, you'll limit the brightness at roughly 400 nits, but give you a fantastic level of contrast and that lifelike reproduction, which is the mode that I actually preferred using while running an HDR game such as Destiny 2. If, however, you want higher brightness, you might want to go on one of the other HDR modes, or indeed go for the HDR peak mode, which will go up to 1000 nits, or close to it. Indeed, here you can get eye-watering levels of brightness on a monitor, and therefore means that you can really enjoy the overall HDR scene. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that when it comes to its overall HDR reproduction, this monitor does a phenomenal job. So that's all well and good, but what about when it comes to console gaming? Well, don't worry, I actually did a phenomenal job in this department as well. At 120Hz with the OSRTD tool used to test the monitor, you'll be able to see that the average initial time, which sits at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, clocked in at just 0.96 milliseconds, with the percent in window sitting at a perfect 100% at 120Hz. The same story was said at 60Hz with the percent in window sitting at 100% and the average initial time at just 1.03 milliseconds. Yet again, when it comes to the overall motion clarity at 120Hz and 60Hz, it's actually pretty good, but yet again over here won't compete with some monitors that offer that motion blur reduction technology. Now it's good to see over here that the manufacturer has included two HDMI 2.1 ports with full bandwidth support. And therefore means that you can run VRR, in other words AMD FreeSync technologies with your modern day consoles with this monitor directly with the HDMI ports. Here, in fact, via the monitor's OSD, you've even got a singular toggle for the HDMI ports for PC or indeed for console usage, which is something that you might want to enable in order for you to ensure that you've got that 60Hz and 120Hz toggle at 4K. So it's safe to say the monitor's gaming performance is seriously impressive, but what about when it comes to the overall image quality? Well, as a reminder, you've got a flat 31.5-inch glossy QD-OLED panel that runs 4K at 165Hz, and therefore giving you pretty good pixel density. When it comes to the overall image clarity, I had no issues whatsoever when it came to productivity or indeed when it comes to reading text. Now furthermore, the overall color accuracy was also pretty good. Running the sRGB mode, which can be selected via the monitor's OSD and gives you full brightness controls, I was able to test its gamut coverage at 83.2% and its gamut volume of 104.8%. Its average delta E sat at 1.75 and the maximum sat at 3.61, therefore making it very much usable for light image editing work or video grading. As for its Tesla's contrast ratio, it's sat at infinity to 1, given it is an OLED panel, and its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat at 5939 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it sits relatively close to the 2.2 standard, but you'll be able to see there are slight deviations towards the extremities. Now, if you're not going to be image or video grading, specifically in the sRGB color space, I would suggest actually going on to the DCI-P3 or better still the native preset, because this will give you more controls and also give you a wider color gamut. Indeed, the monitor will give you a little bit of extra pop and saturation when it comes to the image, and that will certainly be appreciated for the vast majority of consumers, which I suspect will be using this monitor for gaming purposes. Now, apart from color performance, let's talk about the overall brightness. And here in the HDR peak mode, I clocked in 946 nits, while in the other HDR modes, this sat at 840 nits, and in the DisplayHDR mode, it drops down to 429 nits, which I still think is actually pretty bright. Now in SDR, the brightness does actually fall even further down to 242 nits. Now this will be a little bit dimmer for some people, however running the monitor at roughly 80 to 100% brightness means that you can actually use this in a bright sunlit room. Furthermore, it does actually drop all the way down to 17 nits, meaning if you're going to be using this monitor in a completely pitch black environment, it's not going to strain your eyes either. Aside from this, another important factor is brightness uniformity, and on my Tesla's panel, which I do appreciate is somewhat lottery, it did a decent job across the board. As for the backlight bleed, it's non-existent given the fact it is an OLED panel and therefore can switch off all the pixels, yet again giving it a little bit of an edge over some alternatives out there on the market. Now OLED technology such as the one that's housed within this AOC monitor is certainly very impressive, specifically when it comes to gaming. However, there are certain considerations that you should have before actually going out and buying it, and this is very much important for those people who are coming from an LCD panel and looking at getting an OLED for the very first time. Now first off, we've got the burn-in effect, which is something that plagues every single OLED, from a TV to a monitor, and indeed this is no different on this AOC monitor. Now thankfully, you have got a 3-year warranty for burn-in protection, and furthermore you've got a few different technologies in order for you to mitigate the burn-in effect. Now via the monitor's OSD, you can enable pixel orbiting, auto warning, screensaver, logo protection, boundary dimmer, taskbar dimmer, and also thermal protection. There's also a pixel refresh which will be done every so often, but thankfully this can be done when the monitor goes onto standby, therefore not giving you any sort of downtime while using the monitor. but yet again there's some more detail about this via the monitor's manual, so therefore something that you might want to look into just in case you're wondering as to what this actually does and indeed how it might affect your overall usage of the monitor. Elsewhere, you've also got the fringing effect. For those people who are not aware, you've got a slightly different sub-pixel layout on an OLED monitor in comparison to a regular LCD panel. And as a result of this, you might get slightly different coloration behind certain text or indeed certain objects. And here, hopefully, you'll be able to see the differences between this QD-OLED panel and some alternatives out there, including my own LCD panel. Now, what I'll say is while using this monitor for productivity's sake, I didn't actually have any sort of problems when it came to text legibility. This is also further emphasized by the fact that you have got that 4K resolution with that 31.5 inch form factor, and therefore giving you good sort of pixel density. In other words, what I'm trying to say over here is the fringing effect is minimized and therefore shouldn't bother you in the slightest. However, it's just something I thought I should highlight in this video. So past all of this, let's talk about its overall build quality. And here you've got a 3-side balls design with a pretty slim bottom bezel. You've also got an adjustable stand which gives you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. Indeed, it gives you good sort of ergonomics and it's also very sturdy. The monitor stand is not exactly my favorite due to its asymmetrical design, but thankfully if you want to replace it, you can do so via VESA mount. This is provided within the box in case you're wondering, therefore allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or indeed a multi-monitor setup. Now continuing on with this asymmetrical design, you'll be able to see that at the back of the monitor you've also got an RGB ring. This can be enabled and customized via the monitor's OSD or indeed fully disabled because it doesn't really serve a purpose as it's not bright enough to give you that extra level of immersion. Now for you to access the monitor's OSD, there is a small little joystick button that's found at the back right hand side of the monitor. The monitor's OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out, intuitive to use and also very responsive. Better still, there's an extension to this via the monitor's software, which is called the G menu. This can be used if you have got the USB Type B to Type A cable connected up to your computer, and therefore gives you a further extension of the hardware-based OSD. This actually perfectly brings me onto connectivity, and here you've got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input and 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, all of which will be able to output 4K at 165Hz and even up to 12 bits. Here the monitor has got a native 10-bit panel, which is certainly appreciated. Elsewhere you've got 3 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, handy for plugging in your peripherals or for example a flash drive, and you've also got 2 8-watt speakers built in. This will be very much sufficient for listening back to music or indeed playing games, but I would always suggest a set of bookshelf speakers, headphone, DAC or indeed a headset. Or of course, if you want to route audio directly via the monitor itself, you have got a 3.5mm headphone jack output as well. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed video of this AOC monitor. I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. And of course how you feel it compares to some of its competitors. If you have enjoyed this video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.